are sort of going to be debriefing a session that was held yesterday on identifying and combating mis and disinformation, which, as we're going to see, is pretty different. So today I'm here with panelist Dr. Nadia Bliss and journalist Dan Gilmore, both from Arizona State University. So first off, I want to thank our speakers for a great session yesterday. Other speakers who were at the session but are not here with us today, Dr. John Beeler and Dr. Emma Spiro. And it was really a great session. They talked about the role of journalism in attacking misinformation, how this sort of all unfolds in the face of emergencies and natural disasters, and how artificial intelligence won't save us. So first, I sort of want to start with asking our panelists what the difference is between mis and disinformation, and should we treat these differently?
Hello, is this on? This looks on. Okay. Hi, everybody. Thanks so much for sticking around. It's really nice to be in the beautiful Seattle area here. So I guess the way that I tend to think about it, and just as a matter of background, so I'm a computer scientist, a mathy computer scientist by training. I think of misinformation as essentially false information without intent to confuse, whereas disinformation is something where someone has very specific intent to make you believe something which that entity or person know is not true. So to me, it's a question of intent.
I'm going to just say that I have a different framing for it in my own mind, which is that the large category is misinformation, one category of which is disinformation, and there's a whole bunch of things that would include simple errors under misinformation, but I won't belabor that. The one thing I will say is that I hope people will never, ever use the expression fake news.
Yes, please don't.
Because it has been taken over by people who lie all the time, and by definition, it's wrong. If it's really news, it can't be fake. So please don't ever use that expression.
What terms would you suggest then that people use?
Well, the terms to use are the ones that are in this misinformation bucket, but be precise. And I hope that is what people will do, but I've lost this battle. I recognize this.
And so we saw Dr. Emma Spiro, who sort of talked about how emergencies and natural disasters are particularly vulnerable to this type of mis and disinformation. Would you mind talking a little bit about what is it about emergencies that sort of create an environment that's prone to this phenomenon?
Well, people who want to cause confusion take advantage of emergencies and breaking news of a sensational kind all the time, because as one of our panels pointed out, that the main goal is not to persuade people of things that are false, but to add confusion into the information ecosystem so people don't know what to believe. And those are just fabulous opportunities because we are hardwired to respond to these kinds of things, and it's a big problem. We have my urgent request to people is that they take a breath before believing anything. It's a concept I think of as slow news, where I would hope journalists would wait until they've confirmed. That's unlikely, but now I also hope that we as the people it's aimed at will wait before we believe it.
If I can add to that, so something Professor Spiro said yesterday was that a lot of this is sort of, we parse this information with our hearts and not our heads. So there's this tendency to amplify something that appears novel. So there was actually a study out of MIT, I think in 2018, that looked at the spread of tweets and it took something like 6 times faster to spread a false piece of information than a true piece of information. And the underlying psychology, that's still an open area of research as to why that happens. But the hypothesis is that ties to the fact that there's novelty in that false information, and it's generated to essentially excite.
This idea that usually this type of misinformation tends to be a little bit more hyped up and something that people have usually not seen before then. Okay. Yeah, and so something that I found really interesting because, right, this idea that misinformation is bad and we need to get rid of it seems to be not completely true. And so Dr. Spiro talked about this yesterday, which is that seems that rumoring or this idea of spreading claims that are not necessarily verified seems to play an important function in society. So can you tell us a little bit about what that function is?
So I guess I don't want to speak for Emma, but this notion of generating rumors essentially connects people together. So there's a network effect there, and I think that where I would like to take that is something that we haven't touched on today yet is the spread of mis and disinformation, or in Dan's vocabulary, sort of misinformation as the overarching umbrella category. That's not something that is novel. But what has happened recently is you have this confluence of well-defined narrative techniques that are significantly amplified by essentially technology, which makes the cost of spread of that information incredibly low. So if there's basic understanding of narrative theory and how propaganda works and what excites people, it is very easy with very low cost to subvert very large groups of people. And I think that's what's specifically novel about this moment that we're facing today.
The idea of rumor as a filtering mechanism, people hear a rumor and talk about it, often debunk it. That used to take place in places like newsrooms, journalism newsrooms, in bars, corner bars, at the playground where parents were gathered around while their kids played, where people would thrash through the rumors and discount them if it was obvious not true. And now, as we're hearing it, this confluence of technology and ill motives and other things is creating something really new and really disturbing.
Thanks. So basically, right, we've talked about a little identifying and sort of how this misinformation and disinformation happens. So the next step would be to combat that, right? To a certain extent, right? Dan, you talked a little bit about journalism's role in that. So what would you say beyond fact-checking that journalism should do to combat this challenge?
Journalists need to understand how how people with bad motives are using them as a platform to spread misinformation. Journalists need to actively combat the spread by recognizing that they should be talking truth and not just passing on what somebody says, which is too often the kind of thing people do. I call that stenography instead of journalism, just quoting someone who's lying. And journalists need to help the public understand how to analyze and to sort out information coming at them. We all need to work on that.
I think also this is not from a journalism perspective, but more from an individual perspective. Is something that I personally find really helpful is identifying a few reliable sources of information and consistently following those. So for me, for example, it's NPR. And I don't retweet things even from friends if I have not gone and fact checked them. I mean, so that's maybe a little bit too much, but just identifying a few trusted sources and not just assuming that something is getting a lot of clicks or a lot of shares that's actually useful or true.
I agree with the finding trusted sources. In my case, some of them are people, as opposed to organizations. If my friend John Markoff, former technology writer for the New York Times, points to something online, I will quickly look at the headline, and if it looks like it's the real deal, I'll just immediately pass it on because I trust him so much not to screw this up.
So, just sort of following on that, those seem to be more individual changes. Should there be systematic changes, sort of maybe in education, to sort of increase maybe news literacy to be able to attack this?
Do you want to take the?
I'll start. Yeah, we all need to. Uh, we do need a better supply of information, but we also need much better demand for good information. That is, we have to upgrade ourselves, not just the journalism, not just the information supply, and we have to do that at scale. And there are three institutions in our world that can do scale. One is education broadly, another is media, and the third is the companies that now define scale, which is the technology industry, and we need everyone's help in a collaborative way.
I do think so. I mean, I think there's a couple threads there to pull on. So one, I do think the appreciation of the confluence of technology with the social sciences and the psychology and the humanities even that are connected there is a really important area of research to consider, because it's not appropriate to just say this is not new, let's just move on, we can just ignore the propaganda. I'm curious what you think of that term, propaganda. We didn't use that term.
It's one of the categories under misinformation.
Fantastic.
Actually, propaganda can be true. The campaigns from CDC every year to get your flu shot, that's propaganda, but it's good propaganda. So it's lying propaganda would fall under misinformation in my taxonomy.
So the other thing that I would say is I think from a systemic perspective, the incentive structures at the moment do not support sort of combating disinformation. And ultimately, it's going to be advancements in research and technology in addition to changing incentive structures. And whether those incentive structures are done through education or policy or something else, that I don't know what the right answer is. But right now, everything in our system is basically pushing for more clicks. And until that changes, or at least there is some sort of mechanism to counterbalance that, it's just going to continue to happen, which sounds really like a downer. I'm really sorry.
Yes, yeah. Yeah, also I think obviously a good place to start is where you're all starting, doing the research, understanding what is it that moves people to be vulnerable to mis and disinformation. So I guess really that is the first step, understanding and doing the research. So yeah, on a more hopeful note, would you say that is our strongest weapon against misinformation and disinformation?
I guess I would, this is so as I mentioned, I'm a computer scientist, and this is very not a computer scientist answer. I think it's us. I think it's making sure we are sort of rigorous with the facts and are open to, I really like what Dan said, taking a pause and essentially making sure, checking the source. This is true whether you're reading the news or you're reading a scientific paper. So the amount of papers that now go through peer review, sometimes something's going to fall through. So taking that pause, taking that time, I think it's building that information resilience within ourselves.
What she said, plus one thing, I'll flip this back, which is that it's fairly clear we're going to need to combine human and machine intelligence to address this in a comprehensive way, but it will, I think fundamentally, I agree, it starts with us and our brains and our hearts all put together.
So sort of wrapping up, we can go into 4 or 5 minutes of Q&A. What is one thing that you want people to know about this particular challenge of mis and disinformation?
I guess I will come back to the point that I made a little bit earlier. So it is really important to understand what are the underlying foundational components, but that also there's something uniquely novel about this particular moment. And I think it's the confluence of essentially sort of traditional information operation type of techniques with really tremendous scale and access of technology, which can in many ways be very positive, but also creates this environment that, that is vulnerable, and making sure that as we move forward, the technologies and systems and policies that we build protect us against some of those vulnerabilities, which is fundamentally a very interdisciplinary problem. So.
I can't improve on that, but the word collaborate is the key one. This will not be solved by any silo, by any single entity, institution, or trade, or anything like that. It's going to be a comprehensive, collaborative solution, or it won't happen.
Okay, well, thanks to our panelists, Dan and Nadia. So yeah, I guess we can sort of go into a Q&A if anybody has any questions they want to ask. No.
Yeah, okay, thanks. What percentage of the population here has great enthusiasm for misinformation and is spreading it? What is the percentage of the whole population? And then is their enthusiasm much greater for involving themselves in these discussions about misinformation? In other words, are they posting 10 times as much as people who don't believe it, and so they can actually overwhelm a significantly larger proportion of the population that does not believe these things? Thank you.
I don't know I don't have the full numbers on that, but when you say percentage of the people here, if we're talking about this building, I hope it's 0%. If the population at large, I don't think we can make it quite as broad as that, because every one of us has confirmation bias about something. And that confirmation bias will make us tend to buy things that are wrong because we want to believe what we want to believe. So if we don't start there, recognize that at some level we all want some misinformation, or whether we know it or not. So I would start there. In terms of a population who wants to believe things that are wrong, I don't think it's very high. I think most people who believe things that are wrong want to, but not because they think they're wrong, but because they think they're right. The demographic group in the United States most prone to sharing misinformation on social media is seniors, people over 60 and in their retirement age. That's data that came as a bit of a surprise to me, but it's absolutely clear. And I'll go to the converse. There's in surveys we've looked at, and some of our own research seems to bear this out, about a quarter of the population says, I could use some help in sorting this all out. That's a lot of people. To use the cliche, low-hanging fruit, if we start with them, we're going to make a lot of progress. Getting to the people who want to believe things that are bogus, because it's their ideology or their religion or whatever, we have to address them, but I don't know. I think we'd be very effective to address the people who want help first.
I think there's also, so sort of coming back to this notion of incentive structures, right? I mean, like, we're all tired. I am tired, Dan's tired, you're tired probably, I don't know, maybe you're not tired, but, you know, and if everything in this system is designed for us to click on whatever pops up, you know, that it's hard to blame the individual, so you have to think about incentive structures and systemic choices. I mean, the process that I've described, where I literally will go through and like look for the NPR source of the story. If it's not NPR, like that takes work. Most people don't want to do that. So figuring out how to switch that incentive structure so the information that's being served is a bit more robust, I think is a key element there.
Yeah, so when I go through the internet to read news, usually the first news item that comes out that is incorrect, let's say, is sensationalized and it spreads quickly. Then if a correction happens, it's very slow to go and it doesn't spread as wide. So how can we make the correction as effective as the first news item?
First, I want to say this was not a setup question. Because one of the projects our lab is working on right now, where we are developing a tool for journalists to make corrections travel the same social media pathways as the original errors. And you can't repair all of the damage, but prior to this, all we could do was repair the damage in place so the future reader would not see something that was wrong. Now we can start to go back in time and notify the people who saw the thing that was wrong and hope that the people who shared that will also notify them. So we're working specifically on an answer to your question. Whether you can generate the virality of the original sensationalized bogus information is very questionable. I don't think we can, but I think we can make a real dent in this project that we're working on, and I'm quite excited about. We're going to work with news organizations to try and make this happen.
Yeah, following up on what you said, I would think that if I were to have initially forwarded something to a bunch of people that turned out to be dead wrong, then by forwarding the correction, on the one hand it's noble, and on the other hand I might be shaming myself that, hey, I was such an idiot that I really believed this crazy thing. And so then I might just prefer to hope that they get the correct information some other way that doesn't involve me.
Well, I was going to just comment quickly. So both of us are out of our depth here, but this is sort of becomes a psychology question as well. So one of the things that I have actually been, I've seen some literature on, is the type of information you end up seeing and the effect that it has in terms of sticking with you, sort of the stickiness, depends also on whether it is text, so just basic text, a specific narrative structure which knows how to couple into a particular story, or if it's videos. So, I mean, videos, even if you unsee the video or somebody tells you later that the video is fake, it still leaves an impression. And it comes back to that interdisciplinary question as to how do we combat the virality. And the virality doesn't just have to be following the same graph theoretic path through the network. It also has to figure out how to basically undo that impression.
That's the harder problem, and I don't have an answer. But we do have data that journalists who are more transparent about what they do, and that includes corrections, are trusted more by their audience. And we believe strongly that that will map to regular interactions. I used to be afraid of telling people I had screwed up. And then I realized they actually trusted me more when I did. First one is I don't do it that often. When I do, it's something I feel obliged to talk about. And I think if we can help generate that kind of thing in our culture in a general way, that we own up to the things that we make mistakes on, that we can start to address that. But I don't think you should be embarrassed about it. Well, maybe a little embarrassed, but you should say, I'm really sorry, and I'm going to work hard not to do that again. Esther Dyson, an old friend of mine, has a great saying. She says, always make new mistakes.
Yeah, I think you mentioned in the session yesterday that we're all vulnerable to this. Even people who do research in this, we're all vulnerable to this.
You mentioned that videos have the greatest impact. There's now technology that can basically make anybody say anything on video. How do we deal with educating people? Are there tools to find such manipulations?
Yeah, this one's definitely not on. So there are definitely, sorry about that. There are definitely techniques, particularly in image and signal processing. Can you hear me okay? Okay. Particularly in image and signal processing, that essentially look at the distinction between expected patterns of whether it's heart rate or breathing, and then what is seen in the person speaking, and can actually make a pretty good discriminatory judgment as to whether it is a real or fake video. And I can offline point you to some literature on that topic. The challenge is, so what I just said there, basically someone can then write something that is exploiting a different feature vector, right? So it comes back to the point that both Dan and I were making earlier. There has to be a holistic approach, right? So the other problem is that once you actually see a video, and there was a lot of discussion around this when there was the slowdown video of Speaker Pelosi. So even if it's seen, even if there's a label that says that it's fake, it still sticks within the sort of public psyche, and that's a much more challenging problem. I think that comes back to sort of the foundation of education and media literacy and what to trust and what not trust. But there is some really good technical work that's happening in electrical engineering and computer science on identifying deep fakes. And basically it's taking any work that's creating the deep fakes and identifying deep fakes. It's going to be a similar types of research.
Yeah, so I think that's all the time we have. I want to thank our panelists, and thanks for coming.